Okay, so this is just some information on how to make homemade, handmade pasta. Of course, clean hands, clean surface. And with such few ingredients, the importance lies in proportions and technique. So what I will use for ingredients is just short of a half cup of flour. Just short, and I can always add some later. I'm using double O flour. I find that it provides a brighter pasta product. You can use whole wheat flour, it's completely acceptable, it'll be the same amounts. So I'll put just short of a half a cup of double O flour, and then I will have 2 pinches of salt. Now I've dissolved the salt in water, and I'm just going to put that in for some of the liquid portion. And then I'm going to pour in maybe half a teaspoon of olive oil, not very much. And then lastly, I'm going to have 1 whole extra large egg. Then I'll put these over here to clean. And I'll start mixing. You can use just water, but I find that the pasta is very brittle. You can use a combination of egg and water. You can just use egg whites, you can just use egg yolks. So there's a variety of options for your liquid portion. I find that if I use just egg yolks, it probably takes about 2 egg yolks. If it's egg whites, then it just take maybe 1 extra large egg white. Now it's very sticky still, so I'm going to add a little bit of flour. Not a lot, I'll just add a little bit. Adding a little bit at a time makes it easier because it doesn't make the dough too dry. It starts to form together into a ball, and it pulls away from the sides. And so I'm pretty close to where I want to be. I'll take this and do the rest with my hands because I find I can knead it better and I have a better idea of what the texture is. A little more. Good. Now it's a nice soft dough. If you put a little extra in there and the dough is feeling close to where you want it to be, you can take it out and work it on the board. Now it's a little bit shaggy right now. You can see a lot of creases and cracks. And before I add more flour, I'm going to try and see if kneading it gets it to the point or the texture that I want. And it's not, so I'm going to add a little bit more flour than I already had here. Again, not a lot. And then I'll knead it again. Trying to get the little bits off, which is why you clean your hands before you start making a pasta dough or any dough, really. So that when you take the bits off of your hand, they're still clean and acceptable. Notice that the dough is not sticking to the table. I do have a little bit of residual, but the dough will pick that up. I'm looking for a dough that is not sticky. This is a little bit sticky, it's still sticking to my hands. So again, just a little small amount of flour, and I will continue to knead it. Some people like to time, like 5 minutes, 8 minutes. I usually try and look for texture. Now notice here that when I fold it over, I get a crease, and the crease is easily exposed. So it's a little bit on the dry side, but I think that I can get the dough to a texture that I want just by a little extra kneading. Pick up some flour, fold it over itself, and there you go. This is pretty close to what I want. Notice how when I fold it over with a couple of motions, I can get that crease to pretty much disappear. That's the texture I'm looking for. Once the dough is formed, it's going to rest for about 15 to 20 minutes. And I'll talk about that in a minute. There we go. Now this is a very forgiving dough. Let's say that I added a little bit too much flour and I have a dough that's a little bit firm in that I can crease it over and I can't get the crease to disappear. Like I said, this is very forgiving. So what I would do is I would just wet my hands slightly and then continue to knead the dough until it gets to the texture that I want. So if you find it's too stiff, dampen your hands, work with the dough a little bit, and then see how that works. It's better than trying to start all over again if you don't want to. All right, so this is where I want it. Nice, soft dough. I can get rid of the creases very easy with a couple of motions. And it forms a nice, smooth dough. It's easy to press in and it bounces back a little bit. Press down, bounce back. It doesn't have to bounce back completely, but it has some forgiveness to it. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I will take a piece of plastic. The dough is where I want it to be with texture. I'm going to wrap it up tightly. Now, when I'm letting it rest, I won't put it in a container like this, because even though it is in a closed container, the outer edge is going to dry out, and when you roll it out, you'll have two textures: the outside crusted surface when it was in contact with the air, and the inside texture, which is soft. So when I rest it, I will put on a piece of plastic and make sure it's completely covered and tightly wrapped. Now this is enough for 2 good portions of pasta, depending on how thinly or thick, how thick or thin you want to roll your noodles out. This is also freezable. If I do want to use this at a future date, what I will do is let it rest for about 15 minutes, 20 minutes. Then I will flatten it out into a disc, and then I will put it in the freezer. And it will keep in there for several weeks as long as it's well frozen. Now the reason I flatten it out before I put it in the freezer is that if I have a ball and I take it out, a frozen ball after being put in the freezer, if I take it out, when it thaws, it's going to take longer because it has to get deep into the ball and to thaw out as well as the surface. If I flatten it out, it's going to thaw more evenly and more quickly. If I do choose to freeze this, I will have to use it, whatever day I thaw it, I will have to use it on that day. It won't last long after it's thawed, and certainly won't last in the freezer more than a day, so I would use it right up. So I'm going to let this rest, and then we'll come back to rolling. All right, clean hands, clean surface. And we are going to take our rested pasta dough and roll it out. Now, I said something earlier about using frozen pasta dough the same day that it is thawed out. I should clarify that. Doesn't mean you have to eat it that day. It means whatever day you thaw the pasta dough out, that's the same day that you need to roll it out and form it. It will last in its formed state for about a week or so in an ice box wrapped up. So it doesn't have to be eaten that same day, it simply has to be formed. As I mentioned previously, once the dough has rested, it's a little bit more sticky than when I found it to put into a dough ball. Even though I use double O flour to make the pasta dough, I'll use regular all-purpose flour to actually roll the dough out. And you can see it's very sticky. Nothing that can't be solved by just patting it into some flour. This is just regular all-purpose flour. I'll take this aside. This will easily serve 2 people. If you want to make more, you simply double the recipe. So for double, that'd be just short of a cup of flour. It'd be about 1/8 of a teaspoon of salt dissolved in a small amount of water, about a half teaspoon of olive oil, and 2 large or extra large eggs. This will roll out into about 6.5 to 7 inches by 24. So available work surface is an important concern. If you don't have a very large work surface, some things that you can do is take your pasta dough and cut it in half or fourths. And then I'll cover it up, just like I said before. We don't want it to dry out on the surface and be soft in the middle. When you're rolling out your pasta dough, it can be any shape, but you want it fairly uniform so that when it is cut, you have strands that are the same, relatively the same shape. And so you simply start rolling it out. Now, I will dust it with flour and flip it over. During the early stages of rolling this out, one concern is that if you're going to use a machine to form your pasta or your linguine, you don't want the dough necessarily to roll out wider than you can fit into the machine. So one thing you can do is fold over the edges. In the early portions you can do this. Early portions of forming your dough. In the later portions, part of telling when it is ready to simply be lengthened is the fact that you fold it over on itself and it won't melt into itself. So this is still early. I was able to fold them in, and with a couple of rolls, I have a pretty consistent rectangle. And I can widen it out because I have room to fit in the pasta machine. And it's still very soft. It doesn't stick to itself. It's a nice color, nice texture. It's not sticking to me, it's not sticking to the board. But notice that it contracts a lot. So I'm going to roll it out. And then soon it starts getting contracting back. So the importance of that is a lot of people will make it very, very thin and wonder if they're making it too thin. And the answer is no. It is possible to make it too thin, but even at this stage, once I take it off the table, it has some spring to it. These edges are gradually dissolving into a uniform dough. I can almost see the table underneath, so that's good. One other concern, or one other consideration, is that the homemade pasta dough will soak up a significant amount of water or sauce. So if you make it very thin and you know, oh, that's way too thin, just remember, it's going to increase in thickness once it is cooked. Okay, it's starting to stick to the table a little bit, so I'm going to add a little bit of flour just to keep it from sticking. And turn it over. It feels almost like a smooth leather, very, very smooth leather. I can fold it over on itself. It doesn't stick. And there you go. So we already got about a couple inches in side to side, and we're already pretty well stretched out, but I want to make sure that it gets even longer and therefore thinner. So I continue to dust it. Now, as I mentioned, if you have a limited workspace, you could cut this in half, and then you have two pieces to roll out. So that's one way to deal with someplace where you have less workspace. The other thing that you can do, and it needs to be pretty thin for this to work, is I'll put this here. If more workspace is not available, what I'll do is I will take my dough, I won't pull on it, but I will wrap it around itself on the rolling pin and then just roll it up. Now what I can do is I have very small surface, I'll just kind of push out to the sides. Push out to the sides, and I can use whatever workspace I want. Just gentle pushing out to the sides, and then I will be able to unroll it. It's very flexible, it doesn't stick to itself, and some of these creases are not a problem. Just roll them out gently. Probably the easiest way to avoid those creases is one, make sure that the pasta dough is really thin, and two, when you roll it onto your roller, no spaces or creases between the pasta. So I'll try that again. I can almost see the table underneath, so that's good. And you can feel along the side, you can see which areas are lower or thinner and which areas are thicker, and then just work on them. At this point, if I had the edges, at this point, rather than, if I want a straight edge, rather than fold it over and roll it out, I would just cut it off. That's the easiest way to get a nice straight edge. Therefore, the pasta will be uniform in length and shape, and therefore should cook uniformly. So again, if I wanted it even thinner and I have less workspace, I will go ahead and I'll pull on it a little bit just to make sure that there's nice even layers. It's not folded up anywhere. And I'll roll it up. And then just really light pressure, light pressure. If you do this too early in the rolling out process, you won't be able to unfold it. It'll just kind of melt into itself. See, that's even better. Nice and thin, smooth like leather, and that's about where I want it. Okay, so clean hands, clean surface. It's been about half an hour. One other reason for rolling the pasta dough out very thin is that it dries faster. Very thick pasta takes longer to dry. Dry, thinner pasta, and I've flipped it over several times. It's in a state where it's still flexible, but not as soft as when we started. And even though longer noodles are nice, they're difficult to work with, and so I will usually cut these in half. There. And then this can feed into the pasta shaper. Now notice how it just easily feeds in, and I'm getting individual strands of pasta, and I'll hang it here for drying. If, when you start doing this, the strands don't separate, then stop, let it dry some more, and then continue. You can cut this with a knife. If you have trouble feeding the edge of the pasta sheet in, you can simply push down on it, making it thinner, or you can get water and just dampen the edge, and that will help the machine to catch the pasta into the feeder. And then I will take this. You can just lay it on a sheet or a plate or something else, but I find that when you separate out the pieces and the edge, two sides of the pasta strands, the air gets around it and it dries faster. And as you can see, maybe the edges have turned white or blanched. So that gives me a hint that it's the right texture for forming pasta. And also the fact that the pieces separate. There we go. If you decide to cook pasta before it fully dries, which you can do, if you're making a meal, you don't want to wait half an hour to cut the pasta. You can cut it with a knife. Okay, so this isn't feeding in very well, so I'm going to squeeze the edge. If you decide to go straight from rolling the pasta out to cutting it with a knife and cooking it, make sure that it's not going in, so I'm going to dampen my finger with some water and just run it along the edge lightly, and then try it again. And there it goes. As I was saying, if you decide to cut the pasta with a knife after you roll it out and immediately cook it, make sure your water is at a rolling boil to help keep the pieces separated. They will be extra soft at that time. They're not dried. And if the water is not at a rolling boil, they may clump together, and then you have one big pasta ball instead of pasta strands. So that's it. In the future, I will try and make a pasta recipe with just water or just eggs or just egg whites, and we'll see what the difference in texture is.